You know, you walk into a theater, the lights go down, and for 2 hours, your brain just completely accepts a moral simulation.
Right. You are entirely bought in.
Exactly. We sit there, we watch movies like, The Lion King or the Lego movie, Harry Potter, and the central message is incredibly consistent. It is always that the wrong person is in charge.
Yeah, that is always the core conflict.
And we cheer for it. We applaud when the power-hungry villain gets overthrown. We love the idea that unchecked authority is just, well, inherently destructive.
But then the credits roll.
But then the credits roll. We walk out into the blinding sunlight of the real world, and suddenly all those incredibly clear moral lessons we just cheered for, they're just completely thrown out the window.
Oh, absolutely.
We look at a modern landscape driven by, corporate monopolies, political consolidation, immense wealth, and we just shrug. We call it the real world.
It is a massive disconnect.
It really is. So, welcome to the Morning Roundup. Today, we are tracking a collapse. We are looking at what happens when the stories holding society together simply stop working.
And we are going to look at the ruthless battle to write the news story. The battle between politicians, tech algorithms, and even foreign intelligence agencies.
To do that, we are jumping into a really fascinating deep dive today. We are unpacking a massive stack of video sources that cross through some incredibly turbulent waters.
Yeah, we are covering a lot of ground. We are looking at the neurology of power, Christian nationalism, the mechanics of modern cultural warfare, the digital gatekeepers, and the absolute totalitarianism of states like Cuba and China.
It is a wild stack of sources.
It is, and because the videos we rounded up this morning contain highly politically charged content from both left-wing and right-wing perspectives, we need to establish the ground rules right up front for how we are analyzing them.
Right, the impartiality rule.
Exactly. We are not taking any sides here. We are impartially reporting on the content provided in these sources.
We are definitely not endorsing the viewpoints of any of these creators or activists.
No, not at all. Our sole objective is to just pull apart the ideas contained in the original source material. We want to examine their underlying mechanisms and figure out how these ideologies are attempting to shape reality.
So, keeping that in mind, I want to start with that cinematic cognitive dissonance I mentioned. This is pulling from a really fascinating breakdown by the channel Barry's Economics.
That was a great video.
It really was. He asks, why is the villain in almost every story we tell our kids a person who is obsessed with power, but also completely insulated from the suffering they cause?
Right, like Scar in The Lion King.
Exactly. Scar murders his brother, he takes over Pride Rock, the rivers dry up, the animals literally starve, and he could not care less. Or Lord Business in the Lego movie.
Oh yeah, he is willing to glue the entire universe together just to maintain his version of perfect control.
And the audience recognizes this as pure evil. Yet in our actual economy, we often reward that exact same behavior with stock options and political office.
Well, what is fascinating is that the source approaches this not as a moral failing, but as a neurological phenomenon.
Right, really, neurological.
Yeah, they examine the concept of broken feedback loops. So think about how learning actually works in the human nervous system.
Okay.
If a normal working-class person makes a terrible financial decision, say they miss a mortgage payment, their biological system reacts violently.
Oh, for sure. The panic sets in.
Right. Cortisol spikes, their stomach drops. They experience a severe neurological error signal.
Because the consequences are immediate.
Exactly. The brain instantly learns that the action they took caused immediate dangerous consequences, and it adapts to prevent it from happening again. The environment provides instant feedback.
It is a closed loop. The action produces a consequence that directly impacts the person who actually took the action.
But the source points out that for the extremely wealthy or the politically insulated, that loop is completely severed. Well, if a CEO makes a catastrophic decision that bankrupts a whole division, the actual human suffering, the lost jobs, the missed mortgage payments, that gets distributed across balance sheets.
It is absorbed by people they never even see.
Right, thousands of people they will never share a room with. So the CEO's nervous system receives absolutely no biological signal that harm was caused.
Wow. So they do not get that cortisol spike.
Exactly. They might read a memo about restructuring, but their physical environment remains perfectly comfortable. So through adaptive learning, their brain reaches a quiet, natural conclusion.
Let me guess. I am fine, therefore my decisions must be correct.
You nailed it. The source argues it isn't necessarily inherent malice. It is just a psychological adaptation to an environment that is completely devoid of natural consequence.
Okay, let's unpack this because it is like a cognitive firewall. When the lights go down in the theater, our brain accepts the ethical simulation because the stakes are zero.
Right, we can safely cheer for the underdog.
Yeah, we leave our moral compass tied up like a dog outside the movie theater. But the moment we step outside, the brain switches back to survival mode. We encounter a real-life lord business, and suddenly we don't see a
We
villain.
see a networking opportunity.
Exactly. We rationalize the behavior because aligning with power is biologically safer than challenging it.
But the source suggests this rationalization is actually starting to break down on a massive scale right now.
Why is it breaking down?
It is breaking down because the overarching narratives that used to justify these power structures are failing. The source brings in the historian Yuval Noah Harari.
Oh, right, the shared fictions concept.
No. He argues that human civilization is entirely built on shared fictions. Money, corporations, human rights, nations, none of these exist in the physical world like gravity or thermodynamics.
Right, you cannot hold a human right in your hand.
Exactly. They only exist because millions of people collectively agree to believe in the story of them. And Harari argues that we are currently living through a massive narrative vacuum.
So the old stories are failing.
Yes. The traditional stories that structured our world, like 20th century liberalism, classical nationalism, traditional religion, they are struggling to capture the immense, overwhelming complexity of the modern technological era.
Okay, I can see how liberalism struggles with something like, artificial intelligence or globalized supply chains. But why is the collapse of these stories so dangerous?
Because of how we process reality.
I mean, if we realize the story's flawed, shouldn't that be liberating? Like, oh, we can write a better one now.
You would think so, but it is the exact opposite of liberating for the human brain. The brain requires a cohesive narrative to process reality.
Right, we need a framework.
Exactly. When those shared stories collapse, the resulting complexity isn't freeing, it is paralyzing. People get incredibly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of chaotic information.
So they panic.
Yes, when a society experiences story failure, the population doesn't calmly sit down to draft a nuanced replacement. They panic. They reach for whatever framework offers the most absolute, unshakable certainty.
Because the more chaotic the environment, the more attractive a rigid, uncompromising narrative becomes.
Precisely. That narrative vacuum is exactly why we're seeing a fierce battle to replace the old stories with new, absolute frameworks.
Which perfectly explains why we are seeing such a desperate, intense battle right now. And that leads us directly into the debate over Christian nationalism that we saw in our sources.
Yeah, that was a heavy one.
It was. We reviewed a deeply philosophical debate hosted on the channel The Council of Trent between Trent Horn, who is a Catholic apologist, and a creator named Erudite.
And honestly, it takes them quite a while just to nail down what they're actually debating.
So true. The term Christian nationalism is, well, it is frequently deployed as just a rhetorical weapon today. But Trent attempts to pin down the actual mechanics of what his proponents are arguing for.
Right, he cites Stephen Wolfe, who is a prominent voice in this space. Wolfe defines it as a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation.
To procure both earthly and heavenly good.
Exactly. And Trent also references Andrew Torba's vision, which is less about taking over the federal government and more about building a highly insulated, parallel Christian society.
Like having their own economic and social infrastructure.
Yeah, completely parallel.
But Trent himself clarifies that he leans more toward Catholic integralism. Now, for the listener who, isn't deep into political theology, what is the actual mechanism of integralism?
Think of it as a metaphor. Trent describes treating the state as the body and the church as the soul.
Okay, body and soul.
The body has its own functions, its own mechanics, and its own sphere of operation. The soul doesn't micromanage the digestion of food, right?
Right, the body does its own thing.
However, the body ultimately has to obey the soul's moral commands.
Right.
So in Catholic integralism, the state handles civil administration, but the ultimate moral authority, the framework that dictates what laws are just or unjust, is rooted explicitly in the teachings of the church.
And Trent pairs this with a somewhat surprising element, which is libertarianism.
Yeah, that part is interesting.
He argues for a state that is incredibly limited in its size and scope, but one that rigidly enforces high moral standards based on natural law and Christian ethics.
But the immediate pushback from a secular perspective is always going to be, well, what happened to the separation of church and state?
Right, the idea that the state is supposed to be neutral.
But Trent attacks that premise head on. He argues that state neutrality is a complete myth.
A myth.
Yeah, he says the state simply cannot be neutral because the act of governing requires defining fundamental realities. The state has to define what a human person is. It has to define what marriage is.
Because if you don't define those things, you cannot have laws about them.
Exactly. And to prove how impossible neutrality is, he brings up a fascinating 19th century Supreme Court case, Reynolds v. United States.
Oh, the polygamy case.
Yes, this case is foundational for understanding the limits of religious liberty in America. In the late 1800s, the federal government outlawed polygamy, which directly targeted the practices of the Mormon Church at the time.
And their defense was basically, you can't do this, it's our religion.
Right. They argued, this is our sincerely held religious belief, mandated by our doctrine. Therefore, the state cannot constitutionally restrict it.
So the Supreme Court had to grapple with the actual mechanics of a supposedly neutral state.
And they ruled that if the First Amendment meant anyone could do whatever their religion dictated, then the law itself would cease to exist. Every citizen would become a law unto themselves.
Because, I mean, what happens if a religion demands human sacrifice?
Exactly. The court explicitly used the extreme hypothetical of an ancient Aztec religion sacrificing children for a corn crop, or a wife burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre.
The state obviously has to step in there.
Yes, with the threat of physical force to stop those practices, regardless of how sincerely held the religious belief is.
So Trent uses this to demonstrate that every single state, no matter how secular it claims to be, imposes an underlying ethical framework that limits behavior.
And his argument is, if every state imposes an ethical system anyway, why shouldn't it be the Christian ethical system, which he believes provides the most stable basis for human flourishing?
Okay, wait, I'm struggling with that because Erudite brings up a massive counterargument here that feels incredibly relevant to me.
Which one?
She says, if you hold state power and use it to force compliance with your religious ethics, aren't you inevitably going to corrupt the religion itself?
Ah, right. The corruption argument.
Erudite argues that the moment Christian ethics are tied to the coercive power of the state, it ceases to be about the pursuit of the good. It just becomes a cynical game of maintaining political dominance.
That is a very common fear with this.
So how does Trent justify the moral compromises that are required to hold political power in the first place?
He uses a highly specific analogy to explain the morality of political pragmatism. He asks the audience to imagine 100 kids drowning in a pool.
Okay, 100 kids drowning.
90 of those kids are being held underwater by scrawny, weak attackers. The other 10 kids are being held down by 300-pound jiu-jitsu black belts.
Okay, vivid picture.
And you are standing on the edge of the pool, and you only have a blue belt in jiu-jitsu.
Well, if I jump in and try to fight the black belts, I lose, and all 100 kids drown.
Precisely. So Trent argues that jumping in and fighting the scrawny guys to save the 90 kids, while actively leaving the 10 kids to drown at the hands of the black belts, is not a moral compromise.
Oh, wow. So he is saying it isn't being complicit in the death of the 10.
Right. It is being completely rational with the limited power you currently possess. He ties this back to Catholic doctrine, specifically Pope John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae.
What does the encyclical say about it?
It addresses lawmakers dealing with abortion. It states that if a politician believes all abortion is evil, but they only have the political leverage to pass a law banning it after 15 weeks, they are morally permitted, even encouraged, to vote for the partial ban.
Because politics is the art of the possible.
Exactly. You are restricting the evil as much as your current power allows.
But Erudite points out that history shows this rarely stays balanced. She points to James Madison, who was a devout Christian, but who vehemently opposed attacks to fund religious teachers in Virginia.
Because Madison saw the danger in it.
Yeah, he saw that the moment you use state coercion to fund or enforce religious doctrine, you are laying the groundwork for tyranny.
Erudite's core fear is that fundamentalist Protestantism, when blended with the state, creates an environment where laws are passed with the sole justification of the Bible says so.
And in a pluralistic society where millions of people do not accept that premise, imposing that requires a massive, terrifying level of state coercion to maintain.
And this internal friction, this exact debate, is why the political movement trying to implement these ideas is so incredibly fractured right now.
It is super fractured. We saw this in the source from Dr. Zachary Porkue on The Roots of Everything.
Yeah, he breaks down how chaotic the modern right actually is. He says if someone says they are a conservative today, They could be operating from four entirely contradictory philosophical frameworks.
Walk us through Dr. Porky's four faces of conservatism, because this explains so much of the current political gridlock we see.
Sure. The first phase is classical liberalism. This is the traditional ethos of the American founding.
So individual liberty, free markets, that sort of thing.
Exactly, and strict adherence to the Constitution. Then the second phase isn't really a philosophy at all, it's more of a reactionary posture.
Meaning what?
It is a general, broad resistance to modern progressivism. People in this camp might not have a unified vision for society other than just stopping the left's cultural momentum.
Got it. What about the third phase? This is where it starts getting religious, right?
Yes, the third is the attempt to Protestantize American society. This is the push to return to a 1950s cultural ethos, embedding generic Christian morality back into public schools and institutions.
Okay, but what about the fourth phase? Because that one seemed the most intense.
The fourth phase is the most disruptive. It is post-liberalism. This includes traditional Catholics, certain factions of the alt-right, and deep philosophical thinkers who believe the entire experiment of the Enlightenment has failed.
So they want to completely break the traditional left and right dichotomy.
Absolutely. A post-liberal does not view freedom the way a classical liberal does.
How so?
Well, a classical liberal views freedom as the absence of constraint. You can do what you want as long as you don't hurt anyone. But a post-liberal views freedom as the ability to live a virtuous life.
Oh, I see.
And they believe the state has a duty to remove societal temptations that prevent virtue.
So a classical liberal wants the state out of their business entirely, while a post-liberal wants the state to actively reshape the culture to promote the highest good.
That is a fundamental, unbridgeable gap. They're arguing with each other just as fiercely as they argue with the left.
They really are. But both factions share this underlying anxiety, right? This feeling that the cultural environment itself has become toxic.
Yes, that the water we are swimming in is actively harming us.
Which leads us to a source that tackles this cultural warfare from a purely spiritual perspective. We examine this really intense sermon delivered at St. Nectario's Orthodox Church in Florida.
The priest there presents a striking historical claim. He references an alleged 10-point satanic agenda.
Right, created by an occultist in the late 1800s, designed to systematically destroy Christian society.
And the list he reads off is genuinely unsettling because of how accurately it maps onto the massive cultural shifts of the last 100 years.
Yeah, he lists things like removing God from the educational system, severely reducing parental authority over children, destroying the nuclear family structure,
Making abortion and divorce incredibly easy to obtain.
promoting alternative sexual lifestyles, debasing classical art, using mass media to alter human mindsets, and pushing interfaith movements to dilute hard religious doctrine.
And he concludes by saying the final goal is getting the government to actively endorse all of this.
It is a heavy list.
It is. But what's critical to analyze here is the underlying mechanism of why these specific targets are chosen in this alleged agenda.
Like why the family structure specifically.
Exactly. Take the reduction of parental authority and the destruction of the family. Sociologically speaking, the nuclear family is the primary localized safety net for an individual.
It is where you get your foundation.
Right. It provides identity, financial support, and moral instruction completely independent of the state. If you fracture that unit, the individual becomes atomized.
Meaning they're isolated.
Yes. They become entirely dependent on systemic external structures, like the state, the corporation, or the media, for their identity and survival.
So the priest's argument is that this isn't just a natural sociological drift. He is saying it is a coordinated effort to remove the structures that protect the individual from mass manipulation.
And he uses this really evocative metaphor to explain how this manipulation works on a daily basis. He brings up Nancy Reagan's Just Say No anti-drug campaign from the 1980s.
But he connects it to a biblical story, right?
He does, the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. He suggests that modern society is constantly offering us what he calls poisoned wells.
The mechanism of the poison well is profound when you think about it.
It really is. Think about how modern media, pornography, or even infinite scroll social media apps are engineered. They are designed to trigger a dopamine response, promising satisfaction. But they mathematically cannot fulfill the underlying psychological need.
They engineer unquenchable desire.
Exactly. The more you drink from the well of algorithmic validation or digitized intimacy, the thirstier you become.
And the priest contrasts this poison with the living water of spiritual fidelity.
Right. His core thesis is that the true danger isn't just being convinced to do bad things. It is being conditioned to say yes to these poison wells, simply because they are the easiest, most fictionless options available in the culture.
But how do religious institutions fight back against an entire cultural ecosystem that is literally engineered to offer frictionless poison?
It is tough. We looked at a source from Gavin Ortland, a prominent Protestant voice, and he is drawing a massive line in the sand over church leadership.
Yeah, he dives into the highly controversial theological debate over male-only eldership, specifically pushing back against egalitarian interpretations of the Bible.
Ortland's breakdown of 1 Timothy 2 and 2 Timothy 3:6 is a masterclass in how these cultural battles manifest internally within theology.
So what is the egalitarian argument he is fighting against?
The egalitarian argument, which seeks to open all levels of church leadership to women, often relies on contextualizing the Apostle Paul's letters.
Okay, contextualizing how?
They argue that when Paul restricted women from teaching in Ephesus, he was dealing with a highly specific local problem. The women in that ancient culture were less educated and therefore more susceptible to being captured by the false teachings swirling around that specific city.
So the argument is that since modern women are educated, the restriction no longer applies today.
Right. But Ortland completely rejects that contextual mechanism. He points out that Paul doesn't root his command in the local educational standards of Ephesus. He roots it in the Genesis creation order.
Oh, so he goes all the way back to the beginning.
Yes. Ortland is portraying this commitment to male-only eldership, not as some archaic, oppressive tradition, but as an absolute refusal to let modern cultural norms dictate eternal theology.
He frames it as striving for the stature of Christ, even when it makes the church incredibly unpopular and culturally toxic to modern sensibilities.
Exactly, holding the line.
But here's my question, though. Are we looking at a genuine, orchestrated spiritual battle like the Orthodox priest suggests? Or is Gavin Ortland just trying to hold a theological line against a tidal wave of rapid technological and economic evolution that is simply outstripping the capacity of these old institutions to adapt?
That tension is the defining characteristic of our era. But we really have to recognize a fundamental irony here.
What's the irony?
Well, we are analyzing a Catholic apologist debating on YouTube, an Orthodox priest whose sermon went viral online, and a Protestant theologian defending ancient texts through a digital camera.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The very medium they are using to fight this cultural war is fundamentally altering the nature of the belief itself.
Which brings us to the most crucial part of our morning roundup, the digital gatekeepers.
This part is fascinating.
It really is. We reviewed a deeply insightful conversation between Pastor Paul Vanderklay and Garrett White, who is a campus minister.
Garrett tells this amazing story about his own theological journey.
Yeah, he went from being a Baptist to becoming a Lutheran, but he didn't do it by visiting local Lutheran parishes, shaking hands, participating in the liturgy.
No, not at all.
He did it by sitting alone in his bedroom, letting the YouTube algorithm feed him tribal apologetics. He was watching guys like Jordan Cooper debate guys like Gavin Ortland online.
This is a radical shift in the mechanism of human belief. Vanderklay diagnoses this as the church shopper mentality.
Church shopper mentality. I like that phrase.
It makes sense, right? When you mediate religion through a digital interface, you transform an ancient communal practice into a frictionless consumer product.
The user just browses YouTube for the most intellectually satisfying, hyper-specific theological niche they can find.
Exactly. And Vanderklay warns that this UI, this user interface of faith, completely prevents people from becoming feeders.
Explain the difference between a shopper and a feeder in this context for the listener.
Sure. In a physical, local church, the environment is full of friction. You will inevitably sit next to someone who annoys you. You will hear a sermon you disagree with.
Right, you can't just skip ahead.
But that friction forces participation. You have to teach a Sunday school class. You have to bring food to a grieving family. You have to navigate complex human relationships.
You become a feeder.
Yes, someone who sustains the community.
Yeah.
On the internet, there is zero friction. If a creator says one thing you dislike, you click away, and the algorithm instantly serves you someone who perfectly aligns with your biases. You remain a perpetual consumer, gorging on ideological content without ever having to bear the weight of a real community.
It is the algorithm doing the driving. And Garrett White was actually so disturbed by how frictionless this digital world was that he took a pretty drastic step.
I love this part of the source.
He brings up Marshall McLuhan, the legendary media theorist who coined the phrase, "the medium is the message." Garrett was so hyper-aware of McLuhan's warning that he actually went out and bought an old CRT monitor.
One of those massive, heavy gray box monitors
Yeah.
from the 1990s.
He wanted to force himself to tinker with it, to
Yeah.
feel the physical weight and the mechanical limitations of the technology he was using.
McLuhan's core insight is vital here. We obsess over the content of the technology. We ask, what video are we watching? What article are we reading?
But McLuhan argued that it is the medium itself that shapes our reality.
Precisely. When human beings transition from reading printed books to scrolling on smartphones, the physical rewiring of our attention spans and our capacity for linear thought changed permanently.
We embrace these technologies for their convenience, completely blind to how they are structurally altering how we perceive truth itself.
And if the medium allows anyone to build their own reality, what happens to the people who used to control the flow of information?
That is the million-dollar question. We watched an interview between Orrin McIntyre and Harrison Smith, who is a host on the Alex Jones network, InfoWars.
Now look, regardless of how you view the politics or the explosive controversies surrounding Alex Jones, the mechanical reality of how he built his empire is a masterclass in bypassing the gatekeepers.
McIntyre analyzes the architecture of InfoWars' rise, right?
Yes. For decades, the flow of information was strictly managed by Access Media, major networks, the prestigious newspapers. To reach an audience, you had to play by their rules, rely on corporate sponsors who demanded brand safety, and cater to politicians to secure interviews.
But Alex Jones completely circumvented that entire structure. He built his own studio, broadcast directly to the internet, and most importantly, he funded the operation entirely through his own e-commerce store.
Because he wasn't reliant on Pfizer or Ford for ad revenue, he possessed a terrifying level of editorial freedom.
And Harrison Smith makes this really fascinating point about Jones's actual strategy. He wasn't just yelling into a void. His methodology was to take the white papers, the dense, incredibly boring, 500-page policy documents produced by places like the World Economic Forum or the UN.
And he would actually read them.
He read them. The traditional gatekeepers would filter those documents to make global policy shifts sound inevitable, complex, and completely uninteresting to the average person.
But Jones took those same documents and broadcast their implications to the masses in this bombastic, highly entertaining, pro-wrestling style format.
He made the boring terrifyingly relevant.
But when you possess that much disintermediated power, the system will inevitably react to neutralize the threat. The source deeply analyzes the events of 2018, which serves as a watershed moment in the modern information war.
Over the course of just a few days, Alex Jones was systematically deplatformed across YouTube, Apple, Facebook, and Spotify in a highly coordinated strike.
Right. And Harrison Smith argues forcefully that this deplatforming was fundamentally not about the Sandy Hook tragedy.
Now, to be clear, Jones's comments on Sandy Hook were abhorrent, and the family sued him into bankruptcy for the immense pain he caused.
Yes, absolutely. But Smith claims that internally, looking at the internet traffic, Jones wasn't even the primary driver of those specific conspiracy theories online at the time.
So what was the real reason, according to him?
Smith argues that Sandy Hook provided the morally unassailable excuse the tech monopolies needed to execute a test run for massive political censorship.
The mechanism of the deplatforming is what really matters here. By 2016, Jones's audience was so massive that he was demonstrably shifting the national political narrative.
The institutions realized that as long as he had a microphone, their monopoly on reality was broken.
So the 2018 deplatforming was a stress test.
Exactly. Could the tech monopolies erase a major political figure from the digital public square without triggering legislative antitrust action or a mass consumer revolt?
And because Jones was radioactive, the rest of the conservative media ecosystem stayed quiet out of fear of guilt by association.
The test was a complete success. The gatekeepers proved they could coordinate to sever the connection between a creator and their audience.
But the Hydra just grew more heads,
Yep.
right? McIntyre points out that this exact dynamic has culminated in the current era where establishment media is absolutely terrified of the podcasting space.
Oh, they are. They run articles constantly calling unregulated podcasts dangerous.
Why? Because a politician can completely bypass a hostile CNN anchor and sit down with Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn for 3 hours.
They can speak directly to millions of working-class voters in an unedited, conversational format.
The gatekeepers have lost the gate, and they are panicking.
It is a profound shift in power. But we must address the immense burden this places on you, the individual listener. When the centralized system breaks down, the responsibility for discerning truth decentralizes entirely onto you.
Here is where it gets really interesting, though. If the old media gatekeepers lied to protect their institutional power, and the new media is a wild west of algorithms designed to push us into hyper-specific, radicalized echo chambers just to harvest our attention data.
Right. It is a mess.
How is any normal person supposed to figure out what is actually real? It feels incredibly chaotic.
It is chaotic. The West is currently a fractured battleground of competing narratives. But the chaos of free expression, however messy, is vastly preferable to the alternative.
And we saw the alternative in our sources.
We did. We analyzed sources showing exactly what it looks like when a state successfully eliminates all competition and mandates a single unbreakable narrative.
We looked at a video from the streamer Asmongold reacting to an incredibly tense documentary by Nick Shirley. Shirley traveled to Cuba, and the reality he captures on the ground is harrowing.
We're talking about the absolute systemic decay of a society.
The economic metrics Shirley uncovers are staggering.
Following the collapse of cheap oil subsidies from Venezuela, the Cuban infrastructure has virtually disintegrated. Shirley documents that on the black market, a single liter of gasoline costs roughly $10.
To understand the magnitude of that mechanism, you have to realize the average monthly salary for a Cuban citizen is roughly $14.
It is unsustainable. The state-run ration book, the system designed to keep the population alive, is failing catastrophically.
Citizens receive a mere 3 pounds of sugar to last 15 days. People on camera report going an entire year without seeing an egg.
Shirley walks through the National University of Cuba and these massive sports stadiums, and they are completely abandoned. The infrastructure of society has evaporated.
Asmongold accurately describes the footage as looking like a zombie map.
But poverty alone doesn't sustain a dictatorship. What is terrifying is the psychological mechanism of control Shirley captures.
When he tries to interview average citizens on the street about the conditions, they physically recoil.
They are terrified to speak on camera. They tell him explicitly, if you speak out against the government, you disappear.
And it is not paranoia. Shirley experiences it firsthand. While filming, he realizes he is being tracked by undercover intelligence officers.
Yeah, they are coordinating on their cell phones, shadowing his crew, actively maneuvering to corner him.
The climax of Shirley's documentary illustrates the absolute priority of the state's narrative. To escape the surveillance net, Shirley attempts to flee his hotel at 4 a.m.
And he is intercepted by hotel staff. Immigration police are summoned, and he is subjected to an interrogation by a two-star general of the Cuban military.
They knew his identity, they tracked his movements, and they understood exactly the threat his documentary posed to their narrative.
They eventually release him, but the underlying psychological reality is laid bare. The Cuban government possesses the mechanical ability to fix aspects of their economy by opening up to free markets. But they refuse.
They would rather allow their entire population to starve and live in rotting buildings than abandon their communist ideology or admit the narrative has failed.
The story of the state is more important than biological survival of its citizens.
It is absolute totalitarian control. But before you think, well, that's Cuba, that's an isolated island, it doesn't affect me, we need to look at our final source.
Because that exact same mechanism of totalitarian state control is currently operating on American soil.
We reviewed a deeply unsettling episode of the Basecamp podcast, hosted by Simone and Malcolm Collins. They analyzed the congressional testimony of a Stanford student named Elsa Johnson.
Elsa Johnson's experience is a textbook demonstration of transnational repression.
She was an American citizen, studying at Stanford, doing academic research on Chinese industrial and military tactics.
And she was suddenly contacted on Instagram by a profile calling himself Charles Chen, who claimed to be a fellow Stanford student interested in her work.
The mechanism of his approach was highly aggressive. He began interrogating her about her research findings, offering to fully fund trips to China, sending unsolicited screenshots of wire transfers to prove his wealth.
And heavily pressuring her to migrate their conversation to WeChat.
And WeChat isn't just a messaging app. It is a platform entirely monitored and compromised by the Chinese Communist Party.
Exactly. When Elsa didn't reply fast enough, this Charles Chen would delete his messages and resend them just to trigger new notifications.
He even commented publicly on her photos, demanding she delete screenshots she had taken of their private chat.
Think about the implications of that. He knew she took screenshots on her own device. Her phone was likely completely compromised.
She went to the FBI, and they confirmed her worst fears. Charles Chen did not exist.
It was a fabricated profile operated by the Chinese Ministry of State Security. He had already targeted at least 10 other female researchers on campus.
But the true scandal isn't the espionage itself, is it? It is the institutional complicity.
Yes. When Elsa Johnson took this terrifying reality to the Stanford administration, expecting them to protect their student from foreign intelligence harassment, they essentially did nothing.
They obfuscated. They looked the other way. The Collinses explain exactly why an elite American university would allow foreign spies to stalk their own students.
It is financial architecture.
The addiction to foreign money.
Precisely. American universities are facing severe demographic headwinds right now. Fewer domestic students are enrolling. To bridge the gap, they have become overwhelmingly reliant on full tuition-paying international students, specifically from China.
In a single academic year, Chinese students contributed an estimated $12 billion to the U.S. economy.
Elite universities are so financially tethered to Beijing that they simply cannot afford the economic retaliation that would follow if they actively expelled Chinese intelligence operations from their campuses.
The Collinses detail how this operation actually functions on the ground through the CCP's United Front strategy. The primary vehicle for this control is the CSSA, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association.
These groups exist on almost every major campus, presenting themselves as innocent cultural clubs. But the source points out they're essentially government-organized NGOs.
They receive direct funding and tactical guidance from Chinese consulates.
Their purpose is to monitor Chinese students studying abroad to ensure they don't absorb democratic ideals, to aggressively shut down any anti-CCP protests on campus, and to enforce Beijing's political narrative globally.
The institutional capture goes even deeper. The source highlights the role of Confucius Institutes, which are Chinese government-funded educational centers embedded in Western universities.
A staggering 70% of schools hosting these institutes completely failed to properly report this foreign funding to the U.S. Department of Education.
And the consequences of this willful blindness are severe. The Collinses reference a recent case where a Google engineer was arrested for stealing highly confidential artificial intelligence architecture, funneling the data back to Chinese startups while he was still on the payroll.
American universities and corporations are so addicted to the revenue that they have willingly outsourced their own security. They are allowing a totalitarian state to dictate reality on American soil.
If we synthesize everything we've analyzed this morning, the pattern is unmistakable.
It really is.
We started with the neurological comfort of cinematic fairy tales, where the good guys always win and the villain's actions have consequences.
We saw how the collapse of our shared societal narratives has plunged us into a desperate battle for certainty, fueling the intense friction between Christian nationalists, post-liberals, and secularists as they fight to define the moral limits of state power.
We looked at the mechanisms of cultural warfare, the poisoned wells of frictionless media, and the theological lines being drawn in the sand.
We tracked the chaotic, disintermediated digital battleground, where algorithms determine theology and podcasters bypass the ancient media gatekeepers.
And finally, we stared into the dark endpoint of narrative control. States like Cuba and China, who will starve their citizens and infiltrate foreign universities to ensure their story is the only one that survives.
It is all, from the Disney movie to the CCP spy, a ruthless struggle for who gets the power to write your reality.
So what do we do with all of this? Your morning roundup actionable step for today is about reclaiming your own cognitive architecture.
It is about taking control.
Yes. The one thread connecting every source we analyze today is outsourcing. The moment you let a YouTube algorithm dictate your theology, or a traditional media gatekeeper tell you what a policy paper means, or a political party define your morality, you have handed them the pen to write your reality.
Do not let the frictionless UI of modern life do your thinking for you.
Exactly. If you want to understand the United Front strategy, go read the Raw reports. If you want to understand Marshall McLuhan, go read Understanding Media.
You have to introduce friction back into your intellectual diet. You have to be your own gatekeeper.
And as you engage in that hard work, I want to leave you with a final, massive variable to consider that goes beyond our sources today.
If the battle for truth right now is being fought through fragmented social media algorithms, decentralized podcasts, and state-sponsored surveillance networks, what happens when artificial general intelligence fully enters this ecosystem?
Oh, man.
Will a superintelligent AI, capable of processing information millions of times faster than humanly possible, become the ultimate insurmountable gatekeeper?
If we're struggling to navigate a reality shaped by human institutions and crude algorithms, how will we defend our narratives against an intelligence that understands our neurological feedback loops and our biological desire for certainty far better than we do?
This is something to think about.
That is a terrifyingly plausible scenario, and it is exactly why building your own internal resilience is so critical right now. When you walk out of the theater today, keep the cognitive firewall up.
Do not leave your moral compass tied up outside.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you tomorrow.